We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. King David expressed one of the most beautiful acts of kindness to an outcast. For years the half-crazed lunatic Saul had obsessively hunted David like big game. Now that Saul was dead, David had been crowned king of Israel. It was common practice in those days to exterminate all members of a previous dynasty to prevent any descendant from seeking the throne. As long as a spark of life from that family still smoldered, it was a threat to the new king. Yet David's response was a deeper demonstration of love that is undeserved, unearned, and unrepayable. David had made a promise to Jonathan, his beloved friend and the son of Saul, that he would show kindness to the remaining members of Saul's household. David now intends to keep that promise. Our first verse says David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Saul made himself an enemy of David. It was customary in those days for the king of a new dynasty to completely massacre anyone connected with the prior dynasty. David went against the principle of revenge and self-preservation, and asked what he could do for the family of his enemy. David did this because he remembered his relationship and covenant with Jonathan. His actions were not only based on feelings, but also on a promise. Sometimes it's good to remember that if we have any promises that we have neglected, it's better to do it late than never at all. Good people should look for opportunities to show kindness to others, because very seldom will the unfortunate declare their needs out loud. Verse 2 says, "Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, 'Are you Ziba?' 'At your service,' he replied. We are told that Saul's servant named Ziba had the answer to David's question, and upon the king's command, they had him appear before the king. David examined him and asked, 'Are you Ziba?' In response to the king, Ziba replied, 'Your servant is he.' He confirmed that he was the one the king was looking for and that he was putting himself at the king's disposal. Verse 3 says, "The king asked, 'Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?' Ziba answered the king, 'There is still a son of Jonathan, he is lame in both feet.' David asked about anyone left of the family of Saul. In response, Ziba said that Jonathan, Saul's son, also had a son who was alive, but he was crippled in both feet. We learn how he became lame in 2 Samuel 4:4 when after Saul and Jonathan died in battle, to protect him, his nurse took the 5-year-old son away and in the process of fleeing, Mephibosheth fell, and as a result he became lame. Verse 4 says, "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir son of Ammiel in Lo-debar." Now aware that his friend Jonathan had a living son, David wanted to know where he was. In response to David, Ziba said that Jonathan's lame son was living with Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar where Jonathan's son was kept in secret to protect him just in case the new King David ever wanted to harm any of Saul's descendants. Machir may have been a very generous man since he opened his home to Mephibosheth, to show compassion to the son of a prince. Machir later showed he was intensely loyal to David. When David's son Absalom led a rebellion against David, Machir supported and helped David at great danger to himself. Verse 5 says, "So King David had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir son of Ammiel." Now that King David knew that Saul had a living descendant, who was also Jonathan's son, all that he needed to do now was send for him. He had his people fetched him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lo-debar. Verse 6 says, "When Mephibosheth son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, 'Mephibosheth.' 'At your service,' he replied. When Mephibosheth presented himself to David he gave all the respect due to his king. Even though he was lame, he fell on his face, and gave reverence. When the king acknowledged him, he replied, "At your service." This response assured David that Mephibosheth was willing to serve the king and was not a threat to his throne. Verse 7 says, "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." David received Mephibosheth with all the kindness that he could. The king told him to not be afraid and showed his kindness in at least 3 ways. First, David said any property that belonged to Saul will be given to Mephibosheth. Second, David make him a constant guest at his own table where he would not only be comfortably fed, but also have company suitable to his birth and quality as the grandson of a former king. Third, although the king had given Mephibosheth a large estate which was certainly enough to maintain him, because of his father, the king treated him like a member of his family. Verse 8 is not part of our printed text, but in that verse, Mephibosheth responded to King David in a way that indicated he didn't think he belonged in the king's company. He bowed and wanted to know why the king was being so kind to someone who was no better than a dead dog. Verse 9 says, "Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family." David called Ziba, Saul's servant, to confirm to him that he have given all that pertained to Saul and to his family to the grandson. This indicated that David was not only showing kindness, but he was also a man of justice, for he knew that as a descendant of Saul, Mephibosheth had a right to everything that belonged to him, his entire estate. Now Mephibosheth owned it all, and was the master of all of it. Verse 10 says, "You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. The management of the estate is committed to Ziba. David's decision to do this demonstrated wisdom because Ziba was in the best position to manage the estate. Ziba had a large family which included 15 sons and 20 servants. David said that he had plenty of help and the land would continue to provide provisions for his own large family as well as for Mephibosheth. Even though Ziba's job was to ensure that Mephibosheth had plenty of food, David said he would treat Mephibosheth like a member of his own family, allowing him to always eat at the king's table. Verse 11 says, "Then Ziba said to the king, Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Acknowledging the king as his master indicates Ziba's willingness to do everything that David commanded him to do. David repeated Mephibosheth would be treated like a member of the king's family, allowing him to eat at his table and treat Mephibosheth like one of his sons. But let's not think that Ziba would always be faithful to the king, for in 2 Samuel 13:3, we learn that he lied to David saying that Mephibosheth was planning to take the kingdom from him and restore it to the descendants of Saul. Our final verse says Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth had a young son, Micah, who would be the one to continue the family line of Saul. The reason is not given, but in 1 Chronicles 8:34, Mephibosheth is called Meribal. We don't know what kind of life Mephibosheth had while living in Lodabar with Machir. But what we do know is that because of King David's kindness and the justice he showed to him, Mephibosheth was now living the good life. Justice and kindness. David showed kindness and justice to Mephibosheth because he had promised King Saul that he would not cut off his descendants. But David was also kind and just to Mephibosheth because Jonathan, Mephibosheth's father and Saul's son, had been kind to him. As a man after God's own heart, David sought to rule Israel by demonstrating the characteristics of divine justice that God required of all Israelites. To demonstrate justice and kindness, as believers we must be ready to go beyond simply loving those who love us, we must love those who don't love us as well, Matthew 5:43-48, and treat everyone the way we want to be treated, fairly and with kindness, Luke 6:30-33. Justice and kindness. 1. As believers, we should seek out those who need an act of kindness, 2 Samuel 9:1-5. Two people are better off than one, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. 2. Sometimes we may find ourselves once in a high position but now in a lower one, but we still must respect those in higher positions, 2 Samuel 9:6. Obedience is usually the best way to show respect. Without order little would be accomplished. Without authority there can be no order. 3. If you hold a position of authority, you can still be kind and just, 2 Samuel 9:7, 9-12. Be friendly, generous, and considerate, not only when it's easy to be kind, but when it's hard to be. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.